All right, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Frank, for having me here today. Really delighted to be able to speak with your community and hopefully, create some more weaving action of different networks here. I think that's a really key thing for our collective work around climate change and education. So I just, first want to say that, so I'm a social scientist by training in the anthropology and sociology of education. So I think many on this call might be not very familiar with the work of anthropologists and sociologists, but I'll try to, caveat a lot of my statements and the things that I'll be going over today. But I study education systems, specializing in non-formal education delivery, usually by NGOs, especially for marginalized and out-of-school youth in low and middle income countries. So my main focus at the Center for Universal Education is on girls' education and gender equality and education more broadly. So I began researching on the intersections of education and climate change about 4 years ago when I became aware of the disproportionate impact that climate-related disasters is having on girls and women around the world. And since then, I've been conducting policy analyses looking at national attention to girls' education and climate change, which has led me to see bigger gaps in education more broadly and climate action. And so this work that I'll be presenting to you all today emerges from an investigation into these gaps. And in particular, it tries to understand why the global education community and its champions, both at the institutional level in terms of educational organizations, but also at the political level, are really missing in climate discussions and decision-making. So in this presentation, I'll be focusing primarily on the K-12 or the basic education or primary education, secondary education system, especially as it's delivered by governments across the globe. And when I'm referring to the global education community, I'm talking about the supporting community of actors like teachers' unions, civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, and so on. So it's also important to keep in mind that some of these local and global education actors don't always view themselves as a single cohesive community either. So I'm just using this term as a broad way to catch everyone. I'll also refer a lot to ESD, or Education for Sustainable Development, which is a term that UNESCO uses and sort of UNESCO's broader community if and when it refers to things like climate change and education. But I'm going to also use this term a little bit more loosely as an umbrella term to include any kind of education and learning about things like climate change or sustainable development, as well as things like gender equality, human rights, and global citizenship that are integral to the achievement of sustainable futures. So even though there is sort of a particular definition to ESD, I'm using it in a much broader sense. So I think this audience is pretty well versed in the research that points to the importance of education for climate action. So I won't go into why we need to focus on education. But what I'm going to use as my point of departure today is really asking whether or not the global education sector is standing up to the task of climate action. And here the short answer is no. The long answer is a bit more nuanced and the focus of the remainder of this presentation. So the most obvious reason why is, or why not, is a lack of leadership. So while the UN's de facto climate and education arms, the UNFCCC and UNESCO, both recognize the importance of education and climate action, the education and climate communities remain siloed and have done very little to advance political and system-wide leadership for coordinated education for climate action. At the micro level, schools, teachers, and school administrators, they may actually recognize the magnitude of the problem of climate change, but because taking action to transform our ways of being and thinking in this world may actually run counter to many of the school policies and priorities instituted at the macro level, what oftentimes results is little to no action. On the climate side, leadership to enhance action for climate empowerment have also fallen short. So for instance, just over half of countries have a designated national ACE focal point to help strengthen coordination of education activities from schools to the wider public. And if we look at the 5 largest nations here on the table on the right, which together, these 5 nations together account for nearly half the world's population and more than half of global carbon emissions. Only one country here, Indonesia, has an ACE focal point. So this lack of leadership doesn't just affect what goes on within the education sector, within or inside the classrooms, but also means that other sectors like energy, transportation, or waste management don't fully understand the transformative potential of education, nor how to strategically leverage education entry points. So for instance, in a recent analysis that my colleagues and I conducted of 160 my previous work was in health, so I was about to say non-communicable diseases, but this is not nationally determined contributions or the national plans to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. We found that while 68% of NDCs include some reference to education, only 26% of NDCs are making a reference to education that is specific to the education of children. So even then, if education is referenced as a climate strategy, it's framed in 4 primary ways. One, as a general awareness raising activity that enables the success of a non-education sector's climate action strategy. So this would be, for example, education on recycling behavior to support a waste management strategy. Or 2, education would be positioned as a positive outcome made possible by the success of another sector's climate mitigation or adaptation strategy. So here again, an example would be that children might be able to have better access to school as a result of an electrification program fueled by renewable energy. A third way that education is framed in NDCs is as collateral damage in a weather-related disaster. So again, a school is no longer accessible because tidal waves have washed out coastal schools or the roads to coastal schools. And the fourth way that education is framed in NDCs is as a sector in need of development that would improve the adaptive capacity of a country's population. And so this was typically, where NDCs would feature the, education discussions in the preamble or in the introduction of their strategy, where they talk about things like the need to increase literacy of their population in order to increase the capacity of the population to understand things like early warning systems. So such a conceptualization of education misses the mark when it comes to action for climate empowerment because it overlooks the transformative potential of a quality education for children and youth that is centered on transforming our ways of thinking and being in this world through greater social, and ecological awareness, as well as an understanding of issues of equality and climate justice. So what explains why the education sector hasn't stepped up to become a game changer in climate action? This presentation, which is based on a critical review of the literature, a landscape analysis of the climate change and education for sustainable development fields, as well as interviews with climate scientists and education stakeholders. It helps to highlight how 5 major roadblocks, all of which, if addressed, can also serve as strategic on-ramps for the education sector to accelerate climate action. And so these roadblocks, just briefly, are competing priorities, a lack of radical vision, a problem of definition and scope, poor monitoring and accountability, and a lack of support for teachers. So I'll go into each of these further now. So first, when it comes to competing priorities, the global education community has a long list of priorities for government, civil society, implementers, and donors when it comes to supporting countries to deliver basic education services. This is further complicated in countries that are also attempting to address the learning crisis and to ensuring all children, especially girls, refugees, and other marginalized communities have access to education. Then when you throw in high-stakes standardized assessments that then indicate and dictate how time should be used in the classroom, you have a sure recipe for framing things like climate change and sustainable development as complementary to, rather than fundamental to, the vision of education, and as something that is additional to, rather than integrated throughout the school curriculum. And this ultimately leads to the separation of sustainability learning outcomes from academic learning outcomes, leaving education systems and ultimately teachers to have to choose where it and they spend their scarce resources and time. So driving this problem is the second roadblock, which is a lack of radical vision for education. So earlier in this millennia, the UN led efforts to reorient education towards sustainability. Yet analysis of these efforts point to very limited and unsystematic translation of the ambition at the high level into critical reflection and transformation of the education principles and values and practices at the macro, or at the meso and the micro level, that have contributed to our current climate crisis. And this includes an outsized emphasis on individual action and behavioral change rather than on collective action and structural change. It also has tended to glorify consumer capitalism rather than attention to social and environmental justice. And it's also continued to disassociate economic practices from their social and ecological consequences. So as a result, attempts to align education for people and planet still have left learners positioned to perpetuate a world where success is defined by one's ability to control, dominate, and exploit the world. So let's take, for example, the way we talk about the learning crisis. Today, the majority of students that are in school are not learning, at least according to standardized assessments in basic academic subjects. And surrounding this is global discussions around education on the learning crisis that frames this crisis in terms of children's inability inability to read or to do basic math, which then affects their ability to become productive adults. And so in that framing, the aim of the education system is to prepare children to join the labor market in order to nourish a global marketplace. So this is in contrast to framing the learning crisis as children's inability to engage in planetary or systems or future thinking, for example, which affects their ability to be stewards of the environment and of the non-human world. And so where learning is concerned, the discussion has been dominated by skills, workforce, and economic returns. Where the efforts of the education sector has been making inroads is in efforts focused on greening schools, or in other words, addressing the energy efficiency of school buildings, for example, among other things, or in building disaster risk reduction and preparedness within school systems. Still missing here is the critical reimagining of the purpose of education, one that is especially driven by transformational learning and oriented toward climate action. So this brings me to the third roadblock, which is a pretty big and substantive one. It answers the question of what should education be about, and what is quality education in a time of climate breakdown. And so I think we have to keep in mind that the answer isn't that education should be any one type of education. It isn't one type of education about climate change or any kind of education about sustainable development. But rather, if we really want to see this massive shift in the orientation, the behaviors, and the social and economic structures needed to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, we really need to see the social transformation of education as beyond the technological transformation of society, but really emphasizing that sociological transformation. And this itself requires a transformation of education that rejects human exceptionalism, as well as the dominant development paradigms around unfettered economic growth that really undergirds a lot of our education curricula. But the challenge is that ESD, or Education for Sustainable Development, is, as it currently manifests in schools around the world, really suffers from a problem of definition and scope. And the root of this problem is that the UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development really took off before the global education community reached a consensus, not only on what sustainable development should look like, but more importantly, what an education for sustainable development should look like, or an education for that vision of the future, and also on how it should be approached. So this created a cloud of ambiguity as to whether ESD is meant to be an orienting principle or an academic subject. And as a result of this ambiguity, it has failed to be either. So to give you an example, current iterations of ESD tend to be focused on a normative vision of the world, in which sustainable development is sort of the new frame for the status quo. And while efforts may be directed at increasing students' sustainability literacy or their climate literacy, change is centered on low impact actions like recycling or turning off lights. Such an approach is oftentimes at odds with the type of transformational learning that is needed to bring about rapid and impactful change. And when we look at studies and what they say or what they suggest might lead to such transformative change, it's not too much of a surprise that an approach to education that is transformative also redefines what constitutes a quality education. So for instance, rather than teacher-centered, it is learner-centered. Rather than transmissive, it is transgressive. And rather than textbook-based, it is problem-centered and solutions-oriented. One study from San Jose State University estimates that a quality transformative education for climate action can reduce individual carbon emissions by nearly 3 tons per year. And if we look at it at a larger scale, if just 16% of secondary students in high and upper middle income countries were to achieve access to such quality education, the amount of carbon reduced would place education, quality education, in the top 15 solutions to address climate change, with approximately 19 gigatons of carbon reduced per year. So education can have a big impact, but it has to really be quality education. Another issue, though, with the problem of a definition and scope is that because transformational learning is highly political and boundary pushing, without a clear consensus on what education for sustainable development is, or what climate change education should be, what the purpose is, our implementation within our current education systems is going to be nearly impossible. It's also easier to fall into the trap of focusing narrowly on climate science, which in the end of the day contributes to the sanitizing and depoliticizing of climate change from the ethical and the affective dimensions, especially of the underlying drivers of inequality and injustice that then fuel the environmental exploitation and destruction of the planet. And this is inequality and injustice that includes what we have seen recently around racial inequality as well as gender inequality. So in short, without clearly stating what we mean when we demand quality climate change education or education for sustainable development, what we end up with is education about sustainable development and not for sustainable development, or education about climate change and not for climate action. Both of these kinds of education are necessary. The fourth roadblock is really oriented around monitoring progress towards climate action by the international community, but also you could argue for country level, state level, district level, and county level. But our current international monitoring mechanisms don't provide bold enough benchmarks by which to hold governments and the global education community accountable to the health of the planet. So for starters, SDG 4, the Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is sort of the compass that guides the education sector, doesn't mention climate change at all. Instead, all climate relevant concepts are subsumed under a broader target of 4.7, which is focused on sustainable development, global citizenship, gender equality, and human rights. So outside of this vague ESD conceptualization, measurement indicators are actually in this target are focused on science knowledge, pointing back to the issue of the education sector's narrow focus on climate science when it comes to education for climate action. And even then, the measurement framework is focused on prevalence rather than substance. In other words, it's measuring whether or not ESD has been adopted by policy and curricula and teacher education, rather than on assessing whether the substance of such inclusion is oriented towards action and changing the status quo. The one place where the SDGs do mention climate change and education together is under Goal 12, which is focused on sustainable consumption and production. SDG 13, also the one on climate change, also contains a target focused on ACE concepts, or that action for climate empowerment, around education, awareness raising, capacity building, and so on. But these are also more focused, at least the way that they're framed in the SDGs, they're focused on disaster risk reduction, and they frame education as a means to building capacity for people to successfully implement another sector's mitigation or adaptation strategy. So again, here, even within the SDGs, we have quite a low bar when it comes to really a monitoring and accountability mechanism that will really help to incentivize our education systems for that bold and radical action that's needed. The fact that we also don't have data so far, we have not had any collection of data on the SDG target 4.7, also means that we have little information to diagnose our problems in the education system to help guide the education sector over the next decade. And things are not so different from the climate policy side of things either. I mentioned earlier that we did an analysis of NDCs and found that while 68% of NDCs might reference education, only 26% of them do so in reference to the primary and secondary school education of school children. So, you know, again, thinking about the way that education is framed in these climate policies is as a much more general activity. And when we look at this by country type, we can see further that that global climate policies further perpetuate these inequities around education and climate action and climate justice. So just to give you an example, of the top 20 carbon emitting countries in the world, only 3 countries, only 3 of those top 20 carbon emitting countries have NDCs that reference the education of children. Another finding that we found there in that particular study as well is that younger countries or countries that have a larger population of under 15-year-olds are also more likely to have NDCs that are focused on children and youth. So there is not an even spread of attention to education, to children's rights, and to gender equality. So it's, another sort of lacking mechanism. So I mean, just to reiterate that point, this really illustrates the poor extent to which the global ambition for education as an action for climate empowerment has been translated into policy. And such a gap also removes an important opportunity for monitoring progress towards and holding actors accountable to the achievement of education for sustainable development. And so finally, if transformative learning for climate action is to happen, teachers will ultimately be the ones to facilitate this. Efforts to implement climate change education or education for sustainable development are often targeted solely at the teacher, then placing the onus of change squarely on their shoulders. But if we're not sufficiently adopting climate action or sustainability principles throughout the whole organization and culture of the school and throughout the whole educational system, efforts to change the teacher will ultimately fall short. And this is especially the case where the education system does not support teachers to be change agents in the first place. So I think many of you on this call might be familiar with these studies here that have shown that in the US, that while 86% of teachers think climate change should be taught in classrooms, only 42% actually teach it. Such avoidance and sometimes even misteaching of content is likely to be a result of teachers' own knowledge gaps due to limited training, as well as to low levels of professional resilience. And their adaptive capacity as well. And right now, as our current sort of evidence suggests, or I should actually say we don't really have evidence to suggest that teachers are actually accessing or able to access the kinds of materials that could help enable them to be greater change agents in the classroom. We also don't have a good sense of how many teachers receive training and how they are, especially around training to respond to misinformation in the class, and how they might be using some of the resources that have been developed by NGOs. I think that somebody mentioned a professional development program on this call, as well as others that have been being developed by the UN and other NGOs. So it's really hard to get a sense that at an aggregate, how many teachers are actually accessing these opportunities, and therefore, being able to be more empowered in the classroom. And then together, all of this is also certainly not helped by the fact that corporate interests continue to distribute fossil fuel industry sponsored teaching material and learning material into the classrooms. And it's also not helped by the fact that only 20 states and Washington, DC in the US have adopted the next generation science standards, while a dozen or more states have adopted or have proposed legislative measures that ban the teaching of climate change or requires teachers to teach the controversy. So we have a lot of things stacked up against us in this particular roadblock. So what next then? I think, part of this broader project that we're doing at Brookings is to try to really co-develop a roadmap for radical transformative systems change within the education sector. And I think there are 3 particular steps that are necessary. They're definitely not exhaustive. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections based on where you sit in the education and climate change nexus. But these, I think, are 3 at least some clear steps that we're trying to take from Brookings. And the first one is a big task, and it's building consensus on a set of principles, not necessarily a single vision, but a set of principles for radical transformative visions of education in time of climate crisis. While I highlighted earlier that a major roadblock for the education sector is a lack of radical vision around the purpose of education, I really don't think that the solution to this roadblock is going to be for the global education community to come to some consensus around a single vision for education. In fact, much of the literature around transformative education really highlights the need for things to be locally driven, to be locally contextualized, and really based on community needs and community contexts. But what we can come to consensus around is a set of principles that are anchored in human rights and social and environmental justice that can guide communities, whether that's the national community, a continental community, or county-wide education system, to really help guide these communities towards orienting a meaningful, impactful, and transformative climate change education. And so these core principles could include things like the attention to both climate science and climate justice, the technical and the sociological, all of these underlying dimensions and the politics and the drivers and the impacts and solutions around climate change. So really getting a more comprehensive set of principles. I think, again, just to reiterate that the underlying thing we need to bear in mind is that the transformation of the education system for climate action is a systems issue. So we really cannot expect a single intervention to do the work. And so this brings me to 2 points that I want to make around entry points for coordinated action and network weaving across the education system. So the first point is that there are multiple frameworks out there. The 5 roadblocks that I highlighted today suggest a framework for attending to the structural challenges within the education system. And it's particularly premised on the notion that without a radical vision of education for sustainable development and for climate change, governments will continue to lack the scaffolding on which to prioritize education for climate action, including resources for teacher training, curriculum development and integration, and the necessary incentives for orienting all downstream policy and action as well. There's other frameworks out there, like the UN's new ESD for 2030 framework, which highlights the need to prioritize action across key stakeholder groups, including policy, school, classroom, community, and youth level groups. And then there's the IPCC's framework, where they've offered a conceptualization of the coordination that needs to happen between top-down and bottom-up approaches to really align actors with functions that can transform systems like education. And there are so many more frameworks for policy and action out there. And the key really being to ensure that there is coordinated action and dialogue across this ecosystem of actors, and in effect, weaving together the networks of actors in their collective action. The second point I wanted to make about entry points is that we should think of them in terms of scales of optimization, or really thinking about where are those spots in which action at the local level creates the greatest possible impact at the global level. And so here I have adapted the Power of 10 framework that Avit Bhowmik and his co-authors developed to really help us consider how some of the climate interventions that are out there may have a sweet spot at a particular population scale of action. So in particular, the authors that developed this framework found that action between groups of 10,000 and 100,000 people, or at scales between communities and cities, depending on country context, might actually be that sweet spot for targeting interventions for maximum impact of localized climate action. So what I've done here with this particular figure here is to apply this framework to the education system. And so if we think about the similar sort of optimization and scale, this might mean focusing on the school district and the school county levels for some education strategies, while other kinds of education strategies might need to come in at the state level or at the national level. So much more research is needed to really understand what kinds of educational interventions might have, what type of impact at what scale. But I think this offers us a really great way of thinking about how to not only weave together the networks of actors in action, but really think about implementation and optimization. And so finally, also some concrete next steps would be to develop clear guidance and how-tos for decision makers, especially for decision makers who are this year in the midst of, in most other countries, revising NDCs and taking stock of their progress towards the SDGs. and those decision makers who are really eager for tools and evidence that facilitate their work in coordinating action and weaving networks across sectors. So in the context of the US, I know this is a little bit different, but this year being particularly an important year for empowering decision makers with the data and the best practices and the strategies and the partnerships to really develop a locally driven nationwide strategy on education for climate change. So I think also just one more point to make here before I wrap up, that this also includes the need to create space for dialogue and learning by actors who don't typically see themselves as working towards the same goal as education actors. So this means, bringing in renewable energy industries and the technical vocational industries and linking them up better. This also means thinking about the agricultural and the food waste industry and linking them up better with the county education systems and their dialogues and discussions around how to really reorient their systems towards more sustainable development and more climate action. But it's also really thinking about which sort of non-education actors whose partnership and coordination would also be instrumental to reorienting education for climate action that we really need to begin bringing to these dialogues. And again, I think most relevant for the work here that we do at Brookings is really generating a catalog of evidence of best practices and lessons learned from both failed implementation as well as the key ingredients from successful implementation and successful replication that's needed to really create a starting point or a baseline for developing the kind of climate responsive and climate oriented education strategies that we need. So I will stop there. I think that is 30 minutes to the dot, maybe. And I'm eager to hear your critiques and your reactions and your questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Christina, thank you so very much for making the time to be with us today. Really important presentation. So let's open it up to questions and responses and see where this goes. We have only 15 minutes. So let's keep our comments crisp and to the point so we can have most of the time on the conversation. Feedback from you, Christina. So the floor is open. Anybody? And I'm gonna see if that good old hand raising tool can work so I can see everybody. There we go. Anybody?
Jim Callahan has his hand raised.
Oh, there it is. Sorry, I didn't make it long enough. Hey, Jim, go ahead.
Good. Hi, Christina. Incredibly impressed and agree. Coming from a lot of experience, fantastic. I mean, I'm on your third read of your paper. It's fantastic, and I think it's great, right? I mean, study. The one thing I might say, and I think you just got to it toward the end, is, and this is actually applause for ECHOS and ACE, or kind of doing this, is recognizing programs that are doing what you want, right? What you say, they are programs where it is happening. And I mean, I'm kind of asking a softball question here. Is it a good thing that ACE and ECHOS recognizes that and draws strength from that? It's sort of coming from the ground up, right? Sometimes it's going to come up from the ground. Anyway, kind of softball question, but is that good when ECHOS and ACE recognizes programs that are doing exactly what you're saying?
Yeah, yes, definitely. Are we going to take a couple questions, or should I just kind of go back?
Let's just do one at a time.
One at a time, okay. Yeah, no, I mean, yes, definitely. It's always a good thing to highlight best practices and emerging practices for, much more global visibility. I think the challenge beyond highlighting those best practices is really on then what. It sort of represents, I mean, it's kind of like going to a conference and you just see a deluge of great work and then there's no way to synthesize, there's no way to act upon, there's no way, to really generate further discussion. And I think that's the key piece that needs to happen. So I think the work that ECHOS is doing is amazing. I think that the work that the ACE community globally is really, really up there as well. But it's really thinking about how to ensure that, we applaud and recognize what good practices are doing to really make change at a local level, but to not stop there, and especially to not stop there when it comes to thinking, well, what can these efforts potentially do more to trigger further, that further domino effect of change that needs to happen, and not just stop at the boundaries in which they're currently operating. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done to follow up. And that I think is the role of communities like this, that where there is regular engagement and regular dialogue and lessons shared and all of that. So I definitely think that that's needed. But it's really, well, then what can happen beyond highlighting these best cases? Because then eventually we'll have a bunch of best cases, but no collective impact, right? And I think that's really that weaving that needs to happen.
Christina, I think there was a comment as you were going, and I'm like, when I present, I can't look at the thread. I just can't. I can't do it. So, but Tiffany, if you're with us, you raised a point, and I believe the focus on this coordination structure is maybe Colorado. Tiffany, can you speak a little bit about that comment you made, because I think it aligns to what Jim and Christina just said.
Sure. Hi, Christina. Nice to meet you. My name's Tiffany Boyd. The comment that I put in, as a retired elementary school teacher, we are working hard to support teachers, because teachers, when you look at, well, for instance, going forward into the fall, we have teachers who are dealing with COVID-19, systemic racism, online learning. The elephant in the living room is gigantic for teachers. So we're trying to create people to be that bridge for teachers, to bring climate in. I completely agree. I've been to and led lots and lots of professional development as a teacher. And a lot of times teachers listen and they love it and they're on board and they're learning about climate and they know the importance, and they cannot fit it in. So again, I completely understand it's that large systemic change and doing things, and I love your concentric circles that build out. And I feel like whatever entry point we can enter at, whether it's at the school or the family or the city or the state level, we need to enter and do the work now, because it's hard to wait for something like Italy has just done. I know that New Jersey is working on a state. So these are good, but these take a long time to trickle down. What does the professional development look like? Right now, school districts across the country, their budgets have been decimated. So it's finding other ways to get kids' voices heard for climate action and climate change and climate justice now. So yeah, I love what you're doing, and I think it's that coming together of the top-down systemic change and the grassroots together, and all of us just filling in those concentric circles to get the work done. So thank you for all your research and work on this.
Thank you for bringing that point forward, Tiffany. I think it complements exactly what you're seeing, Christina. Given we have 10 minutes left, do we have any other points? We have a lot of people on here. No time to be shy. Go for it.
Can I jump in and just sort of, I think actually some of so Tiffany and I actually have connected over the last couple of months, and I see the work that she's doing with the retired teachers, and I see the work that others in Clean and, elsewhere as well do that, but like Christina said, it's kind of these bubbles, right? It's like someone like Jim does such great work to connect with teachers or connect with students that's not necessarily in the schools or in the school district. Tiffany's doing this work. I know Jessica Bean on our leadership board does a lot of this work, right? The support of teachers to bring it beyond just the professional development and actually get this into the classrooms and having students do investigations is so important. And I see this happening, but as Christina mentioned, it's kind of these bubbles, right? Somebody's doing it here, someone's doing it over there. And so Tiffany and I have come together, and Jessica Bean, and we're trying to develop a task force, and I have a few other names from this group as well that we may reach out to get your feedback on this as well. And so we're trying to think about how do we develop a model that would work for, in Tiffany's case, it's the retired teachers. In Jim's case, he's just someone who has a passion for this, but how do we think about like structuring that and making it more of a collective action effort? So we're starting to think about that, but I agree. I think there's a lot more work to be done. I'm really happy to see this presentation and as Tiffany mentioned, the coming together, hopefully, of these different circles. So I just wanted to kind of throw that extra piece out there that we're trying to work on that as well.
So we have Lindsay, you want to go next, and then Deborah will be after that.
Sure, mine's more of a comment, and it's pretty much, it's in line with what Katie was talking about. And I don't think it's something that we're gonna be able to answer now, but I guess if Frank and Christina have ongoing conversations about this, it would be nice to know that this is represented in there, and maybe some ideas can trickle back to us. Is well, you recognize as one of the roadblocks are these silos that exist, and you know, we create silos everywhere to make our work easier in different ways, right? And especially in the education system, we have silos that exist horizontally and vertically in different ways. And I just would like a really systematic way of thinking about how to break those silos down and how to do that effectively. And then maybe if we had a model like that, then we can each take it into our own areas of work to think about how to apply it to our region, or then, you know, maybe even to our locality in terms of the district that we're in. Because I believe that there's roadblocks and barriers that exist within schools, within districts, within states, and then within regions, and of course at the national level. And I just think that there should be some model in the research that exists of like how to deal with this, because it exists everywhere.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That's a really great point. Christine, do you have any quick feedback?
Well, I wish I had the answer to that. There's obviously not an answer here, but more of a comment back to your comment. But you know, I had an interesting conversation with some folks over at the Global Partnership for Education on, I mean, because I mean, they're looking at, they're unfortunately not really looking at climate change, but they have been, you know, very much thinking about other sort of cross-sectoral issues that affect education. And one of the things that they brought up to me that I thought was, for me, sort of a mind changer in the way that I thought about breaking silos was to think about government mechanisms that exist already that have been set up to intentionally bridge silos and to leverage those more. Because what we tend to do is to create more work for people. And so by saying we need this cross-sectoral committee, we need these people, you know, we need some representative from one sector to go to another one. What ends up happening is that you just create more work, and when people go back to their day-to-day activities, they just can't squeeze it in. Just like I think Tiffany was saying about, you know, you come to these professional development opportunities and you love it, but then you just can't work it into it because it just isn't part of your system. And so I think what I learned from GPE, the Global Partnership for Education, is to really think about identifying the existing, and it might not even be formalized mechanisms. These might be informal things, like the way a department might be set up, you know, or physically in a building. It might be ways that certain kinds of, you know, financial or budgetary meetings are set up so that certain representatives are coming in from, you know, a number of different sectors to a single meeting that could be leveraged for further discussion and further coordination. And so that's led me to think a little bit more about not trying to create new things, but really trying to leverage existing structures that enable the kind of work without putting more work on people. So I think, because ultimately it comes down to people have limited time and limited bandwidth. And so and like you said, silos intend to make things easier. And so if we're trying to break those silos, we can't create more work for people, because then it will easily just pitter out, right? And so really thinking about how to leverage existing mechanisms. So I don't know what that looks like in this particular context, but I think it at least provides some insight into thinking about what exists that we can, you know, transform without adding, you know, to. So that's, you know, with the thought that came up.
Gotcha. Clearly an excellent point, Lindsay, we're gonna have to go into. Deb, you want to close us out today? Because it looks like we're gonna be hitting our time after your question.
All right.
Sure.
Frank, this is Bonnie. I did want to say one thing before we close out, but I don't need to go before Deb. I just wanted to let you know I wanted to ask
I got you.
a question if I
All right,
could.
thank you.
Thank you. I'm on the phone, so you couldn't see me in Zoom is why I butt in. I'm sorry.
Okay, Bonnie.
So I think that, Christina, you and I will continue this conversation tomorrow if you look at the email I sent you for the follow-up, but I really wanted to share this with others on the call. So I'm almost feeling like there's a second generation now of people who are entering in terms of ESD and climate education. That could just be because I've been doing this for 40 years. I remember going to Australia where they had a strong national plan for getting ESD going and why it didn't work. Top down, I can't go into all the details, but top down without the middle and the bottom ups support. And then I see a lot in the US where we've seen the bottom up and the middle level, but we don't have the top downs. And they'll work for a while and then they'll stop working. So we worked with the National Association of School Boards, and we worked with the National Council for Social Studies and with the National Science Teachers Association. And I know you say, 36%, there's so few that accepted the second generation science standards. And I'm like, yeah, I didn't know if any were. So we take our celebrations where we can get them, but then we look at the leverage points for systemic change. I think that people have a self-concept that they can only work at the level that they're at, and they forget to look at doing systemic change measures. The people on this call maybe are better at that than others, but helping people to be effective change agents who are systems thinkers as part of our education system will help with the climate education piece, with the transformative learning piece, and with all the other SDGs that we need. So maybe this is a time for another report to come out, this follow-up research that will give this vision, but these visions are not new. These understandings are not new. And I look forward to continuing the conversation because it's really about who and how. Where's the money flowing now? Where's the time constraints on jobs now? And how do we reorient job descriptions and performance appraisals so that this becomes part of the have-to-dos instead of the extra add-ons? I look forward to any feedback people have and the follow-up tomorrow, Christina.
Thanks, Deb. Christina, do you have a response?
I think I agree entirely. How do we build it into everything so that it's not an add-on? And I think that it really means changing our incentive structures and the way that we evaluate performance and success and impact. So I agree.
Gotcha. Bonnie?
Thank you. And I will be really brief because I see we're out of time, but everything that's been said has just resonated so well with another part of my work, which is working with Indigenous communities. And I want to suggest, if it hasn't already been suggested, because I didn't hear it, but maybe it was, that cross-cultural efforts are a great way to, number one, help communities that are struggling with climate change to have a better voice. And number two, to find another entry point where there is action happening and there's interest in action happening, and then building the ability for those communities to participate. It brings in that crossing over silos and breaking down barriers and braiding together multiple knowledges. And so I think that that's another entry point that I hope we will consider as we move forward with this work.
Yeah, that's certainly something that I've seen in the girls' education community, which is where most of my work is located. And it's all about inclusion and participation and engagement. So I think that's spot on. It's really trying to identify the communities that are most affected by the inequalities and inequities that are sustaining their marginalization, and including them into that process and empowering their capacity is key.
Absolutely, Bonnie, that is a really important point. In certain countries, that's going to be a much more important point. In the United States and Canada, absolutely critical. So